Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Alley, and thanks for being with us with less than 1 week to go until the election. And today I'm joined by two members of our ballot measure team to break down the top 15 ballot measures across the country. You know, covering ballot measures is a project that kickstarted Ballotpedia and got us on the journey to where we are today. So this is one of our favorite topics to go into. Each year we publish an article detailing the biggest issues we're following. This year, it seemed like it was kind of harder than ever to cull that list down to 15. We might have even played a few tricks to get that number to 15. So anyway, there's a supremely high volume of really interesting ballot measures across the country. Let's just jump right on in. I'm joined now by Ryan Byrne, or regular on the show. Ryan, welcome back.
All right, thanks for having me, Jeff.
And Nicole Fisher, one of our key ballot measures writers. Hey, Nicole. All right. Well, we're in that final stretch. Election news is pretty hot and heavy, of course. Maybe just take a minute or two and tell our listeners, what does it look like on the ballot measures team in those last 2 weeks before the election? I think it's so readily evident to people that there are certainly, a great many ads that people are seeing, and their emails are getting blown up with fundraising messages, and you're getting text message to turn out and things like that. But what's it look like in the ballot measures project? What kind of, sort of high volume news is happening in the last couple of weeks? So take us through what that looks like.
Yeah, I can jump in here, Nicole. You might have some interesting thoughts as well. Really, you said the word news. It's news. And this really isn't odd. Ballot measures don't often get much attention until right before an election, and then everyone's going, what in the world are these things? And campaigns know that. Campaigns know that a lot of the attention is like September, October, especially October. So this is really where they roll out endorsements, arguments, campaign finance really picks up. Really just have a lot going on. The atmosphere around ballot measures this time of year just becomes much faster paced.
Yeah, definitely. You're definitely seeing a lot more campaigning, especially around the measures that may be more controversial, more political. A lot of them are attaching themselves to candidates or to certain issues. So we're seeing a lot of media editorials come out endorsing measures. So definitely a lot more activity closer to Election Day.
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting you mentioned endorsements in light of the recent week's events with respect to their presidential election endorsements. Newspapers across the country endorse ballot measures really at high volumes. I think we probably see newspaper endorsements at a higher rate for ballot measures than newspapers endorsing actual candidates. It's pretty common. So yeah, lots to process there, but let's just dive right into it. So Ryan, can you talk a little bit about the factors that go into us picking the top ballot measures that we're watching this year?
Yeah, I think you said this towards the beginning. We can't do a top 50. I mean, maybe we could, but I want to be very practical for readers or for our teams. But it really does feel that way this year. It feels like there's a lot of these notable measures that are getting a lot of attention from readers, from media, from political parties, so on and so forth. So, it's not just one or two factors when we're crafting this list. We're really thinking about where is the public interest based on our readership, including from various perspectives. We're not just considering the highest quantity, but how people on different sides of the aisle are kind of viewing ballot measures. Campaign finance and spending is always a big variable. What are the most expensive ballot measures? And perhaps most importantly, considering how a ballot measure fits within the broader political landscape, debates, conflicts, whether that's a big trend like abortion, or, there's one redistricting measure in Ohio. And obviously redistricting is something that, various sides of something are going to have views on because it's going to affect things.
Yeah, so let's dive into sort of our group one here with respect to abortion rights and reproductive issues. There are 4 measures here. So we've covered abortion ballot measures specifically a few times recently on the show, but let's really take a look at them as a whole in the context of other ballot measures and the races across the country. So with 11 statewide abortion ballot measures nationwide, 5 made the cut for our top 15, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and 2 in Nebraska. So what makes them stand out to you? How do each measure differ in terms of the restrictions or protections they offer, Nicole?
Yeah, so each of the 11 measures, do a job in either amending the Constitution, amending state law. I think these 4 are probably the most interesting because on one hand, you might have Florida where you have the most expensive abortion measure in history. You have a lot of campaigning around that Florida measure. You have Arizona and Nevada, which are considered battleground states. So there's conversations on how those measures may impact turnout. And then in Nebraska, you have this sort of competing two abortion measures that could be interesting for voters. So in Arizona, Proposition 1, this measure would provide the right to an abortion up to fetal viability, with some exceptions after viability, depending on the life or health of the mother. So Harris recently endorsed this measure. There's been a lot of campaigning on this measure. I've seen video clips recently of volunteers for this measure saying that they hope that the turnout for this measure could impact the presidential race. There's some conversations on whether that may or may not impact turnout as far as down ballot races goes or for the presidential race. So this measure is pretty interesting as far as the national perspective goes. Nevada is a similar amendment on the ballot, so would also amend the Constitution to provide rights to an abortion with exceptions after viability. Nevada is also a battleground state. So Florida is interesting because unlike the other measures, it requires a 60% majority. So other measures require a 50% majority, Florida 60%. So it's going to be harder to pass in Florida. And Trump came out opposite to this measure, whereas Biden endorsed it. And like I said previously, it's the most expensive abortion measure ever. So there's a lot of campaigning around it, a lot of money going into both sides for this. I think for the support campaign, it's almost 110 million in support of it, and about 10 million in opposition to it. And Nebraska, we have this interesting situation where you have two measures competing with one another. So you have Initiative 434, which would amend the Constitution to prohibit abortions after the first trimester, and Initiative 439, which would establish the right to an abortion prior to fetal viability with some exceptions afterwards. So the competing aspect of them makes it pretty interesting in Nebraska.
Yeah, we spent quite a bit of time writing about that and talking about that here at Ballotpedia this year. The competing nature of those two ballot measures, it's really unique. It's the first time that we've seen that, I think, right?
Yeah, so it's not very common. In Nebraska, two states this year, we have Arizona and Nebraska having competing measures. So in Arizona, you have two related to the electoral systems. I think Ryan might discuss more about that later. In Nebraska, we have the two abortion-related measures competing. So the last time we saw two competing measures on a statewide ballot was in Missouri in 2018. So they were both related to marijuana, but voters approved one and rejected the other, so they didn't have the situation where you approve both of them and wonder which one will take effect. So in Nebraska, and as far as a lot of other states, the rule usually is that the measure that gets more votes, period, will take effect. In Nebraska specifically, the governor is going to dictate which areas they may conflict. So the measure that gets the most total votes will be the one that goes into effect.
Oh, it's going to be a really, really jam-packed night trying to make sense and keeping track of all of the various different abortion ballot measures. So great number more abortion ballot measures over the last sort of 3 or 4 election cycles than we've seen in the last 40 years. So you can read a heck of a lot more about that on Ballotpedia's article on a history of ballot measures related to abortion. But it's not just states that are putting on abortion ballot measures, right? There are some local measures as well. So what's going on at the local level?
Yeah, so we wanted to include some local ballot measures. They often get overlooked, but local policies have sizable effects. And I will say, local ballot measures address all sorts of things, but abortion is one thing that they don't usually address. That's not usually something you hear about at the local level. So voters in 2 cities, Amarillo, Texas, and San Francisco, California, are addressing abortion as a local ballot measure. And specifically, they're addressing this question that I feel like has gotten a lot of attention, especially in the media, on whether governments can penalize individuals who are leaving somewhere to go get an abortion somewhere else. So in Amarillo, the ballot measure actually aims to prohibit residents from obtaining abortions outside the city. Now, the supporters of that, they do have it written into the text that they acknowledge that there's likely constitutional limitations on this, and the ballot measure is just going to be enforced to whatever that limitation is. And then in San Francisco, we have the opposite, where the ballot measure would prohibit officials and public employees from sharing information with out-of-state or federal law enforcement about abortions, legal abortions that happen in California. So both of these cities are kind of positioning themselves as sanctuary cities, to use that term, which is more familiar from immigration debates. Amarillo Initiative actually uses that language. It calls itself a sanctuary for the unborn, whereas the San Francisco measure actually labels the city as a place that safeguards comprehensive reproductive freedom. So you have San Francisco and Amarillo really butting heads on this issue.
Yeah, can you remind our listeners what exactly is a sanctuary city?
Yeah, so, a sanctuary city as it applies in the immigration context involves how local officials interact with federal officials. So if there is someone who is in the country, without documentation, they're here in violation of law, that jurisdiction might not cooperate with federal officials. So it's kind of the same idea, but with the issue of abortion, where San Francisco is saying we're not going to cooperate with federal or out-of-state officials like Texas per se over the issue of abortion. And then Amarillo is kind of taking the opposite approach and saying, we are a sanctuary for the unborn in regards to abortion.
Yeah, so one of the things that we cover a lot at Ballotpedia and we talk a lot about on this podcast is, the really unique nature of federalism in the United States and the different ways that different levels of government interact with one another, whether that's with marijuana rules and laws or with sanctuary cities like Ryan's describing, or now potentially with abortion measures as well. So how local, state, and federal governments interact, it's just one of the many very interesting aspects of our political system. You can read about, for instance, preemption all on Ballotpedia, about situations where state and federal or state and local laws are in conflict and, well, who wins essentially. Very interesting, right? So to summarize, Nicole, can you kind of help put it in perspective for our listeners? Why are these measures coming up in this volume? What's being sort of said in the big picture about why we're seeing this many ballot measures, and what does that tell us about this election, and how is it going to impact elections beyond just the actual measures themselves?
Yeah, so obviously after the 2022 U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade, we're seeing a lot more of these measures either amending the Constitution to provide for the right to an abortion or to amend state law. And because Roe v. Wade overturning did turn this back to the states, we're seeing a lot more states respond to it. So we're seeing a ton of citizen-initiated measures mostly. So citizens coming together, putting this on the ballot to change their state constitutions. We're seeing some state legislatures also put it on the ballot. But it's interesting to note that since the Dobbs decision, every pro-choice measure or measure that had pro-choice support has been successful. And every measure that had pro-life support was not successful following the Dobbs decision. So I think we're seeing a lot of people turn out regarding these measures. There's a lot of people that care about the measure. Either they support or oppose abortion. So I think for voters that care about this issue, it's definitely going to be significant in especially these battleground states or just turning out, period, caring about this issue. So yeah, the 11 issues on the ballot will have, direct effect on the constitutions or state law, but also the issue as a political issue, I think will also drive out voters to the polls.
Well, we could spend a whole episode just talking about the abortion-related measures. So really interesting stuff, right, Nicole? But let's move and talk a little bit about measures that relate specifically to elections themselves and voting. So we're kind of calling these group 2 electoral systems and voting rights. And we've got a handful of measures here in Alaska, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Arizona, Ohio, and many more. So we're going to get into that right now. So with this theme that we're seeing, basically measures related to how we vote and who can vote. There are ballot measures related to ranked choice voting initiatives, either to allow it or to ban it. There are non-citizen voting bans in states. We've got full episodes on these topics already. You can go back and listen to those earlier shows if you're interested. But Ryan, can you highlight a little bit about the trends that are sticking out to you here?
Yeah, sure. I think this is really fascinating, but something that people might think is, well, where is this new? And I think when you look at the history of ballot measures, there's been kind of these waves of electoral changes. The ballot measure, especially the ballot initiative, has always played a big role in the states that allow it in terms of shaping elections in those states and how they're run, the systems that are used. So we're seeing a large number, but most of them do kind of fall into two groupings, two collections, if you will. One of those is RCV, ranked choice voting, or other electoral system changes like top 2, top 4 primaries. And often they're combined with each other. It's kind of interesting. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. And then the second group is really around non-citizen voting bans, which are largely coming from legislatures.
So with ranked choice voting measures being considered in several states, what's driven the increased interest in this area, and how does that trend compare to prior efforts to create change or adjust our voting systems?
Right. So there's definitely some element driving the sheer number of these ballot measures, I think. At the local level, like I said, this type of thing's been around for a long time, broadly speaking. At the local level, we've seen a lot of RCV since like 2015. And then it started to show up in state elections, Maine in 2016, Alaska in 2020, and Massachusetts in 2020 as well, though we often forget about that one because it lost. Nevada in 2022, they're voting on again, that's a quirk with Nevada where they vote and initiated constitutional amendments twice. So, it really took off this year. We have 6 that could enact RCV, 1 to repeal it in Alaska, 1 to prohibit it in Missouri. Plus, there are some of these electoral system ballot measures like top 2, top 4. It's a big year for electoral reform proposals in general. And one of the things that's really driving it is funding from these national groups like Unite America, Article 4, Final 5 Fund, and some others. That's not to say there aren't volunteer-driven drives as well. We were just looking at signature drives, and the one in Idaho, for example, was volunteer-driven. But these groups, they seem to believe that now is an opportune time to make this investment. Looking at their commentary, they definitely think that people are at a point where they really don't like the major political parties, and they're hoping that that kind of pushes people to make a shift in how elections are organized and run.
Yeah, and the non-citizen measures, how have those performed when they've been on the ballot in prior years? So this is not the first year that we've seen those measures, right?
Yeah, so it's not the first year we've seen the non-citizen voting issue either. That's come up in 8 states this year, but it's come up in other years as well. It's just, again, it's kind of coming to a head this year where you have a lot more states, 8 of them, addressing this one issue on November. And, I hear there's a lot of commentary about it in terms of like, well, this isn't really an issue. They're just trying to arouse a reaction to turn out people to the polls, which, might be part of the story. That's often part of the story with ballot measures. Ballot measures do something, and these do something. They also relate to a broader political environment. You see a lot of politicians talking about this, but in terms of their practical effects, there is something. They're preemptive. And I think that's something that people often miss. So some states do allow cities to authorize non-citizen voting, a few in California, Maryland, Vermont, DC. In fact, in Santa Ana, California, voters are deciding on a local ballot measure to allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. And since these would be added to the Constitution, sure, federal law already prohibits it, but this would essentially tell cities, yeah, you can't do that. You can't allow non-citizens to vote. So, none of these states this year currently allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. I mean, if someone decided to bring it as an initiative to California, we would definitely see a big fight there. But they're looking to California, they're looking to Maryland and some other states, and they're preemptively putting these on the ballot. To get back to that issue of preemption that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so often that's what's the case here. And what's really interesting with these sort of electoral system fights and sort of on-the-ground battles is that it's not necessarily always a sort of clean division over who's supporting who's opposing them. So, for instance, you have, Alaska, Colorado, Nevada. Those states in particular are kind of interesting to see the different sides that are lining up. So, Nicole, what accounts for some of the differences that we're seeing there in the RCV battle in those states?
So while Colorado and Nevada are voting to sort of expand RCV or implement RCV, Alaska is voting on a measure to revert RCV or get rid of it and go back to a partisan system. So you can look at the politics of the state and how ranked choice voting has impacted previous elections. So in Alaska, you had a Democratic candidate, Mary Peltola, who defeated Republican Sarah Palin and Nick Begich. I hope I'm saying his name right. And you have Republicans coming out in support of this measure to overturn ranked choice voting and to return to partisan elections. So I think it's interesting looking at all of these measures statewide because you have Colorado, for example. And really, when you look at the arguments for ranked choice voting, a lot will argue that it kind of empowers third-party options. It kind of reverts from the two-party system or offers more choices. However, some would argue that it could favor more moderate candidates. So Colorado, you have the ranked choice voting measure to let it in the state. You have a Democratic governor supporting it, but you also have the Republican Party, Democratic Party, and Green Party all opposing it. So it's just interesting to look at maybe the politics of each state and how others may view these measures from a political perspective.
Yeah, and you can read a heck of a lot more on Ballotpedia about the different arguments in favor of and in opposition to ranked choice voting, to see the different groups supporting it, both financially and with endorsements. We've got all that on Ballotpedia. If you went into our podcast archives, we did a 4-part series about ranked choice voting, including the arguments, a little less than a year ago or so. So there's a great volume of material on Ballotpedia that you can dig into, listeners, to learn more about ranked choice voting and other electoral systems. So Right. How about Arizona? What's going on with those competing amendments this year?
Yeah, Arizona's really fascinating. I mean, Nebraska has those competing abortion ballot measures. Arizona also has competing ballot measures. This one's even more tricky because if they both pass, there are some pretty obvious points of conflict, but there's some areas that might not be. In Arizona, that means it will probably go to the courts if both pass to kind of figure that out. But anyway, to talk about them, Proposition 133 and 140. So 133 is from the legislature and 140 is an initiative. 133 would add the existing system to the Constitution. That's partisan primaries, how it's done in most states. Republicans go vote in their primary. I think Arizona has a semi-close system, so independents can also go vote in those primaries. And then the party nominates someone, and they compete against each other. So Proposition 133 would basically just put that in the Constitution and preempt other systems from being used. 140 kind of takes this different approach where it doesn't directly dictate what type of system needs to be used. It's just saying a different one based on certain criteria. So it would require primaries in which candidates, regardless of their partisan affiliation, appear on a single ballot and a certain number advance to the general election. So that could be top 2, that could be top 4, that could be top 5. Very similar to what you see in California with top 2 or Alaska with top 4. Republicans and Democrats running in the same primary and a certain number will move on. Proposition 140 says, hey, legislature, you pick. If you don't pick by a certain date, the Secretary of State will pick. So that's pretty interesting. And then it would require, if it's top 2, then it's just 2 people running. If they pick something more than top 2, like top 3, top 4, it would require ranked choice voting to be used. So again, maybe ranked choice voting, maybe not. It depends on how it's going to be implemented. So again, these contradict in some ways, but not necessarily every way. So determining those points of conflict, if both pass, will end up in the hands of the courts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Arizona has quite a large volume of ballot measures this year, and in part because that's something we've talked a little about that on this show before, but Arizona has a divided government. You have a Republican state legislature and a Democratic governor. And what that means essentially in playing it out is the Republicans couldn't get all of the bills they wanted enacted to be signed by the Democratic governor. So what a Republican legislature will do in that case is to say, okay, we can actually put something on the ballot without the governor's signature. That's a pretty standard practice in states with legislatively referred constitutional amendments. So they go ahead and they put it on the ballot before voters, knowing that they couldn't actually get a bill enacted because it would have been vetoed. So it's kind of an interesting long-term play out of elections. So Nicole, kind of going back to the 8 states considering non-citizen voting bans, what do we typically see in terms of who's lined up in support and opposition to these measures?
Yes, we're looking at conversations and who's supporting or opposing them. You tend to have Republicans more supportive of the non-citizen voting bans. Democrats tend to be in opposition to them. And I think both sides would argue that they're trying to protect the voting process. So you have Republicans trying to, again, we talked about preemption, to protect the Constitution from ever allowing, non-citizens to vote. You have Democrats arguing that these elections or questions in the ballot can be distracting or kind of call into question the integrity of voting. You have other measures too that also, when we're discussing voter access and eligibility, we have a voter ID measure as well in Nevada. So again, Republicans that would support this measure would argue that this would protect from voter fraud, it's protecting the voting process, whereas Democrats could argue that this would instead hinder the voting process or make it harder for those who may not have identification. So I think both sides would argue that they're trying to protect the process or trying to protect our democratic process. So yeah, it's a very interesting question on the ballot. We'll see what happens with those.
So you can kind of see, listeners, our math here. One topic can sometimes carry maybe more than one ballot measure. That's our way of kind of cheating the system a little bit, but hope you won't fault us for that. Let's move along to our last group then. We're going to kind of call this our sort of grab bag section here. A lot of the measures we've talked about so far probably have been in some national news. You've probably heard about them already in one way or the other, but some of the ones we included here in this section, might be flying a little more under the radar. So these are some of our favorites sometimes in that respect. So it's always fun to get those grab bag ones in there. So let's dig into some of these 5 ballot measures that we're looking at here. And so Nicole, how are national debates about education and public funding playing out locally?
So we're looking at, there's 3 states that have measures on the ballot related to scholarship questions or school funding. So you have in Kentucky and Colorado 2 questions related to school choice programs. So The Colorado Amendment 80 would add a new section to the Constitution to state that each child has the right to school choice, which includes charter, private, and home schools. Kentucky Amendment 2 on the ballot would provide the General Assembly can provide financial support to the education of students outside the system of common schools. So a lot of supporters of these policies would argue that it provides parents with more choice and it funds private schools or homeschooling if parents choose to not send their children to public school. Opponents would argue that this would take money away from public schools and you're providing money to private schools that might not be held to the same accountability as public schools. And you have one measure in Nebraska, so referendum 435. It would repeal legislation that allocates about $10 million each year for a scholarship program. And what's kind of interesting is you look at since the year 2000, there's been at least 3 referendums against school choice policies. So you have in Arizona, Utah, and Washington all previously voted on these measures. And in each case, voters repealed the legislation in favor of school choice policies.
Very interesting. Yeah, referendums are always very fascinating and can be somewhat confusing to voters. You got to be careful reading those measures because sometimes a yes vote might mean to repeal and sometimes a no vote is to repeal. So like every other part of your ballot, read it carefully. So Nicole kind of talked a little more. How do these measures align with or diverge from past trends in education policy?
So we do see a lot of education measures on the ballot. I think since 2006, we have the most amount of education measures, though a lot of them really relate to funding, bonds, sort of standard ballot questions related to the funding of schooling. Occasionally, we see more national political issues, such as school choice. We have some sex education ones in the past 10, 15 years that may play into larger political conversations. But for a lot of these, we see mostly just related to funding and bonds. We see more measures in the 2000s than in recent years, but this year has been probably the most since 2006.
Just to add a little bit more to that, I think, Nicole's observation is definitely correct. We have had less education-related ballot measures than in the past, and this year is kind of, like it is in a lot of ways, reverting to a bit of some previous trends with more measures.
Yeah.
And Nicole touched nicely on the school choice-related measures. I think there's 2 more that probably should be called out, but they're not necessarily part of broader trends. Education, sure, but they're quite specific. In Florida, they're voting on making school boards partisan. They're currently nonpartisan, so the elections, which is really interesting because most states do nonpartisan elections. A handful don't, so Florida's looking to join those. And then the other one actually has to do with a topic that I feel like we really heard a ton about in the 2000s, with like No Child Left Behind and all that stuff, which is standardized testing. And standardized testing is on the ballot in Massachusetts in terms of whether it can still be a requirement or not for high school graduation. So it'd be really interesting to see how those questions kind of play out as well.
Great deal of interesting education measures on the ballot. Well, let's hang out in California a little bit longer and talk about Proposition 36, which addresses drug and theft crime penalties. Ryan, what are the broader implications of this initiative, and kind of what's the history behind how we got there and how California voters are going to see this measure?
Yeah, California Proposition 36 is really related to another number, Proposition 47. So all these proposition numbers. So this one's from 2014, Proposition 47. California was enacting a number of criminal justice changes in the 2010s, especially through ballot measures. Proposition 47 is probably the most well-known one because it reduced penalties for certain crimes, such as theft, shoplifting, especially things where goods are valued under $950. As well as certain drug possession offenses. So, the effect of Proposition 47 on criminal activities has been a pretty big topic of debate in California. It played out in the recall a couple years ago. It's played out in a number of elections where people say, this measure has caused an increase in crime. Others will say, based on the analysis, this is not what's driving that. So you have these competing narratives there. So Proposition 36, anyway, would change these policies. It would revert some of them or change them to something else, such as charging theft and shoplifting as felonies, even when it's under $950, kind of using this 3-strike rule. So strike 3, charged as a felony. People convicted of these crimes could face longer prison sentences instead of the current one, which is currently set around 6 months. Sentences could also be adjusted based on the value of those stolen goods, and there will be a number of changes to drug offenses right now, including like some policy changes around fentanyl possession. So supporters say that these changes are going to address a number of loopholes in Proposition 47 that, in their view, have increased criminal activities. And then Governor Gavin Newsom's actually opposed to this new ballot measure, Proposition 36. He was part of the campaign for that 2014 measure, Proposition 47. And he sees this new change, again, Proposition 36, as not really addressing loopholes. He sees it more as moving backwards towards a war on drugs type policy.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how that one will shake out then. So let's hang out a little longer on the West Coast, Ryan, and talk about Washington. Now, Washington is another Democratic trifecta state. They got kind of an interesting energy initiative on the ballot. So what are we seeing in Washington, Ryan?
Yeah, so there are actually two energy initiatives on the ballot in Washington. And I think a lot of this has to do with the state's legacy, or specifically Governor Jay Inslee's legacy around energy policy. He's very much positioned himself. I think he did this when he ran for president, kind of talked himself up as, being the governor who's attempted to address issues of climate change. There's been a number of policies enacted under his tenure, and some of them are now coming up for a vote. There's a new conservative group called Let's Go Washington. They petitioned a number of legislation onto the ballot, not as veto referendums, but, as direct changes of statutory policy. One of them has to do with natural gas regulations. The other one has to do with carbon tax credit trading programs. People might know those as like cap and trade or cap and tax. So one of them is called Initiative 2066. And it would actually prohibit state and local governments from restricting access to natural gas, among other provisions. And then Initiative 2117 would repeal one of those keystone pieces of legislation for Inslee, which is the 2021 Washington Climate Commitment Act. So, yeah, of course, I think all this relates to national policy. Ballot measures, if something might not fly in the Democratic trifecta of Washington with voters, other state governors, legislatures might be hesitant to pass similar bills. Energy is always a really fascinating one. They often can be pretty expensive fights. We're seeing this play out a little bit in other states too. South Dakota has one about carbon pipelines. It's a whole nother topic, really interesting. In Oregon, there's some local ballot measures about offshore wind farms. Kind of these advisory questions about whether people like them or not, how they want their counties to interact with the federal government. So we're definitely seeing that up in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, a little bit in Oregon, these issues around energy.
Yeah, a lot of times what we notice, right, and you know this probably better than anyone, national groups that are behind an issue will usually try one state first. They want to see how that one goes, and if it's successful to the best of their interests, then they'll start expanding to other states. So, we're kind of seeing that this year where you've got a mixture of states with high volume topic types like ranked choice voting or abortion, where those measures essentially have been tried in prior years, and now they're trying to essentially scale them out. You could call it franchising to some degree. But there are some cases like maybe this Washington one, Ryan, and maybe you can speak if there are any others that are sort of like it, where it almost seems like there's like a new tactic or a new approach being taken. And, depending on the outcome, we might end up seeing that being sort of like foreshadowing what we might see to come in the next 2, 4, and 6 election cycles. So does that make sense? Are there other ones like that, Ryan?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. We just talked about California too, right? So like the criminal justice policy. So you have a number of states, they enact policies, and people with the veto referendum or the initiative will attempt to repeal them. And sometimes if you see that successful, again, it's going to deter similar legislation, perhaps even on a national level. You've seen a lot of discussion around things like natural gas. I think, right, we saw a bunch of people talking about last summer around like gas stoves and this and that, maybe some interpretations of an EPA regulation proposal. This is people directly, kind of looking at that and voting on it. So they can have a lot of influence.
Yeah, Ryan's a little bit about those advisory questions, but again, that's a whole nother episode. So, all right, well, we're 14 down. One last topic here. So, Nicole, let's go back to Florida and let's talk about marijuana legalization, which has been pretty steady stream of ballot measures over the last almost 20 years now at this point. So what's going on in Florida with marijuana?
So Floridians are also, along with the abortion amendment and some other measures, are also voting on a marijuana amendment to legalize marijuana in the state. And so a lot of people are wondering, will these measures pass? How will they do? Well, both the abortion measure and the marijuana measure are, I think, number 2 and 3 for the most expensive measures of the year. And they're both the most expensive of their kind. So the Florida abortion measure is the most expensive abortion measure ever. There's 110 million so far supporting it. And I think with the marijuana measure, I believe it's 120 million supporting it. So most expensive marijuana measure ever. So this impacts, TV ads and impacts the amount of campaigning in that state. So we don't know how that can impact the measures. But with polling, the abortion measure looks, the last poll we had from the University of North Florida has it just at 60%. So again, you have a majority supporting it, but in Florida, you have the 60% requirement. So that poll is right on the nose. And New York Times has it at 46 to 38. So 46% supporting, 38% opposing. Emerson College has it at 58% supporting and 31% opposing. So again, a majority, but not quite at 60%. So the abortion amendment could be really close. The marijuana amendment looks a little more popular. So we have a University of North Florida poll had 66% approval. Another Emerson poll, one has 60% approval, one has 64% approval. So that could also be close. So again, I think it depends on just how many people show up and turn out. You have some politics playing into this as well. So we had President Trump coming out and opposing the abortion amendment, but supporting the marijuana amendment. So we don't know how that can play into voter turnout, but they're definitely going to be interesting, both those measures in November.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Nicole. And remind me, so what is the status of Florida's marijuana legalization landscape? And then how does that fit into the context of the sort of current national status of which states have medical marijuana legalized, which states have recreational, and kind of where does that currently fall?
Yeah, so, Jeff, it's really interesting, marijuana ballot measures. You mentioned that they've been around for a while, and they've been, I'm not going to say largely successful because they have been rejected in a number of states, and we're seeing repetition. South Dakota, North Dakota voting on it again. Florida, this is the first time they're voting on recreational marijuana. They did vote to legalize medical marijuana, also via a ballot initiative, in 2016. And, they had a bit of a history there where they rejected it once, I believe the election cycle before, and then they approved it in 2016 by a much wider margin. So I think the biggest thing in terms of why we're looking at Florida, and Nicole mentioned the 60% vote, that's always a big thing. That's something that's driving that, driving the notability of this, right? It's just harder to pass a measure. But another thing is that this is the last big state with the ballot initiative where marijuana is not legal. So all eyes are kind of on Florida. The funding is on Florida. A lot of the states where marijuana could be legalized via ballot initiative have done so. So we're kind of starting to run low on them, if you will. I think the trend might start to taper off in the next couple election cycles. But you still have a number of states down the middle of the country, the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, where they could use the initiative to legalize marijuana. And they're either actively pursuing that or they likely will in the next couple election cycles.
Got it. Well, we've completed our journey through the 15 top ballot measures to watch. Ryan and Nicole, thanks so much for your time today. Have a great rest of your week before the election.
Yeah, you too, Jeff. Thanks.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode. You can expect On the Ballot to be coming at you pretty much daily through election season, keep you up with the latest news and developments. Please make sure you can subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Ballot, and thanks for listening.